a biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
Right now on the line we do have Stephen McAlpine. Stephen is a recognised Christian commentator. He's an award-winning author. He's a pastor and he's also a national consultant for churches and Christian schools. When I say, I say recognised commentator, and I think it's probably what you expect me to say because it's a good intro line, but I'm not actually buttering this guy up because, for example, recently the renowned Australian foreign affairs journalist, author and commentator Greg Sheridan, many of you will recognise his name, he actually gave a shout out to Steve for his work, paying him a very high compliment. And those of us who follow Stephen's work were not at all surprised by that. So, Steve, welcome back to Vision 2020 and thank you for giving us some of your valuable time.
Oh, thanks so much, Wendy. That's a great introduction. And yes, I listened to Greg being interviewed about his latest book the other day on 2GB, and a line he said was, Stephen McAlpine is right. And I said to my wife, I wonder if we could get that on an embroidery.
I'm sure. And next time your wife questions anything, you just go back. Yeah. Greg Sheridan said, yeah. Okay, I have so much I wish I could talk to you about this morning, and I sort of wish you were the big part of this morning because there's a lot that's been coming up on your Facebook lately that I would like to ask you about. But let me ask you the first question, and this is particularly in light of the various massive marches we are witnessing across our nations on the previous weekends, with, might I add, what appear to be polar opposite views. The question that I want to ask you to start with is, are we headed for civil breakdown in the West, and particularly here in Australia? That's what my question is.
Well, interestingly, I think I saw that question raised in the UK and the US. I do think that democracies are more robust than that, but I do think there's civil unrest. We're seeing civil unrest, and I wonder what the tipping point would be to tip it over into something a little bit more hostile. But you're seeing the two very polar views marching across the same territory on different weeks, having to be fight by police, and some of them having less than moral upright people within their ranks. Shows that we have a very polarised society at the moment in the West, and we're watching it with interest. And I think that's because there's a breakdown in the central narrative of what the Western project is for and what it's about.
So one of the things that I'm seeing in these marches as well, and on both sides of this polar sort of opposite views, we are seeing any sort of respect for leadership is just not there. Like our governments particularly are increasingly on the nose, and that's happening in shorter spaces of time. We see a huge rise in independent votes and minor parties. So is this one of the problems that we have, that we have no respect for leadership?
Yeah, the institutional issue's been around for maybe since the sexual revolution, I think. The song, The Things That They Say Ain't Necessarily So. I think the last 60 years has seen a drop in institutional trust. And we saw that in the church, that during the Billy Graham crusades of the 50s and early 60s, there was this flowering of Christianity in Australia especially. And I'm in Sydney and I noticed its historical tail still wagging a little bit. But then there was the institutional issues there. There was the crises in the US over Vietnam and Watergate. So it's taken a long time to get to this point. But what you're seeing now is a quicker churn. You vote someone in and within a few months they're on the nose. And so the distrust level that around politics especially has reached a point where people are going, well, I don't recognise the government and I refuse to recognise the government that my peers voted for. And so I think you're seeing that. And so, we love diversity, don't we? But the flip side of that is a movie like Children of Men, or a book like Children of Men, which is one of the great movies of the 21st century, where there's this fractured England that's in tribal settings. And you can sort of see those things coming. It's not as if they're not on the horizon at some level. So I think we're in for a time of seismic upheaval, I think, in the West in particular.
Well, we certainly have seen it on both sides of these big marches. So we've got the pro-Palestinian march, we had the Australia March for Australia, both of which were calling out against the government. But I think when I looked at I'm encouraging, we might get to it, but if we don't, I really encourage people to go onto your Facebook and have a look at your commentary on particularly the March for Australia, because I really loved your very balanced view there too. And I would be totally aligned with your views on that. I wouldn't have marched. But one of the things that I saw coming out of that march was this call about housing and living costs, that sort of thing. And I can understand why people are feeling disenfranchised. I can understand why people are feeling like there's a big, wider divide becoming in Australia, and we haven't had that. We've been quite egalitarian, really, I think. But we're seeing now, even for average Australians, holiday in Australia, a simple holiday now seems out of reach for many. So is that part of the problem that we're seeing as well?
Yeah, I think what you've got with the housing prices issue, people are always I think people generally in middle Australia are 2 to 3 pay packets away from oblivion, if that makes sense. And they feel that. And I think what you see in the march, and what I thought was interesting was that the Prime Minister, even though he's very left-leaning, said there's validity in some of the issues. And so did David Pocock, who's a very left-leaning independent MP. So what I'd want to see in the left of government is a return to some of the grassroots working class issues that maybe 60, 70 years ago, working class political left was very much for the working class. And there's been a sense that the middle to elite progressive framework on the left has despised the working class. Now, how you corral that or how you appease that is going to be interesting, because the thing I said about the march on Sunday was that conservatives can get hijacked very quickly by the neo-Nazi framework, and they don't have a coherent single-focus narrative in the way that progressives often do. So you're seeing these churning groups all clamouring for the media to present them in the way that they wish to be presented. And that's part of the problem as well. The mainstream media is not trusted. No one's going to align themselves with, less people are aligning themselves with middle ground perspectives in any institution we have at the moment.
One of the things that you said in your Facebook post about the march is this is actually a direct quote. You said, "Once I saw good-meaning folk from the conservative side of politics," I'm totally with you on that, many of my good friends marched. "Once you saw good-meaning folk and culture start to say what last weekend's protests would and would not be about before the event, the message was lost." I was trying to get my head around what you were actually saying there. What are you saying about the message being lost when we had to explain what it was about?
Well, I think marches and all imagery, and a march is an image. So when you see 90,000 people on a bridge or crossing a bridge, that's an image. The specific messages within it are sort of subsumed within it. And so marches are very image-oriented. So what the conservative side of politics wanted to say, and it wasn't just conservatives on the weekend, what they wanted to say is, we'll set the tone of what this is about before it actually arrives, given that we know certain people are going to turn up who we don't want to be there. But since it's image-oriented, the first image you're going to see, and the highest caliber image you're going to see, is of people from a neo-Nazi perspective who were there. And so if you're scrambling around beforehand with caveats to say our march isn't about this, it's not about that, you kind of lost it already, because a march is not there for nuance. It's there to create a very strong image. And so the march is a very modern thing in one sense. No, there's been marches before, but in the modern media world, you have one crack at the image and you can't control that. And if you start to say beforehand, here's what it's about, here's what it's not about, you already know that people are coming to that march who are going to, in a sense, hijack it in an image sense. And that's what happened, I think. Even though I think many of the marchers were very, were down the line about what they were saying, they don't get to control the narrative. The narrative is controlled by the people who broadcast the image to the rest of Australia. And that's not that's the media.
Yeah, that's good. So you just mentioned before the left side of politics and the hope that they would see that there is and understand where people are coming from. Is there, when I grew up, I guess there was a binding narrative. There was an identity in our culture that was fairly across the board. And I guess for me that was a more of a Christian understanding of our culture. But it was even people who were not identifying as Christians. There was a commonality in our understanding. There was a common sense. We've lost that, haven't we?
Well, what I say to people is that people who weren't Christian in the 50s and 60s and perhaps into the 70s, they weren't Christian in a kind of Christian way. It was the Glenn Scrivener air we breathe thing, the Christian air that we breathe. So they would, as Greg Sheridan points out in his trilogy of books, or maybe I'll call it a trinity of books now, Christianity, there was just an assumption. And those assumptions have broken down. And part of that's to do with the intellectual capture, I think, of our universities by a much more left-leaning perspective that is more Marxist or Marcusian in its dialectical approach, that there is the oppressor and the oppressed, there is the victim, there is the person who's perpetrating, all these different things, which are very dialectical. And that's how Marxism works. It works in that dialectical approach. And so in one sense, what our culture has done in the last 50 years, it's been forced to take polarising positions, and it's done so at a time when our social media has amplified that and rewarded those kind of polarising positions. So we're in this feedback loop, I think.
One of the things that you say on your Facebook commentary is our social fabric will not be destroyed primarily by external sources, but from internal sources. And you talk about the problem in Australia not being immigration. We're not being invaded from the outside, but from the outside, but rather it's being hollowed out from the inside. That's one of the things that you say. Could you expound on that for me?
Yeah, well, look, America is the great immigrant nation. And the reason it's the great immigrant nation is because the product, America, and you can all you can all make something of yourself in America, was so overarching and so compelling that immigration subsumed itself under that narrative. And so what you'd get was a very diverse group of people, but kind of united under a common bond. What you now, I think, have is there's been over in the last 50 or 60 years a pushback against the Western narrative, the Christian framework, the way the West was built, as being something that isn't just wrong but evil and has kept people down. And so what you get is a self-loathing in the West that is probably not that does not exist in other nations. There's a sense of retrospection that Christianity gave to people. Look, don't assume you don't have bad motives. Don't assume that you're not sinful. Christianity gave that to the culture. So in one sense, we've had to check ourselves all the time as a Christian West that, maybe we're doing the wrong thing here. Maybe we're not doing the right thing there, in a way that other major cultures have never viewed themselves. And I think Christianity is both the saving grace of the West, but it's also the thing in a post-Christian setting that some of our ideas have been taken and used against us. I think that's a critical issue we're dealing with at the moment.
As we've moved away from and we've become sort of self-loathing, I think, of our Western culture, I feel like people have lost the ability to really think. I sometimes feel like shaking people and wanting them to really think. And you just touch on some of the things that I've been frustrated about, I guess, when you see the Palestinian March and you see flags, Queers for Palestine, and you know what would happen to those people if they actually were there in Palestine, and that seems to go completely unnoticed. But then when you have a March for Australia and you have somebody holding up a megaphone that has Nazi symbols on it, that's jumped on. So I feel like people don't think these things through.
Yeah, look, I think there's that too. And one of the other things about Queers for Palestine, for example, is that it is actually a subset of any minority group that has felt that it's been isolated in the West. It's banded together. So in one sense, they are co-belligerents towards a bigger enemy. So the Queers for Palestine, well, the Palestinians may not like queer people in their community, but the bigger enemy is the 500-pound gorilla called the Western narrative. And so what you get, and you see this in the LGBTQ community as well, that the T has come apart from the LGB. And that's only happened when they've started to win position. They'll fracture in their belief systems when they hold power. But when they view themselves as minorities outside of power, the biggest enemy is the Western framework. If they got power, they would start to fight with each other. I think that's what we'd see. So what you're getting, I guess, is ethics in the Western setting is driven by aesthetics. It's not driven by intellectual process. It's driven by what looks good and what doesn't. And I think that's what you saw in the same-sex marriage debate. You saw it seemed to be about a fair issue. It seemed to be about that nice couple that lived down the road. And so fairness and aesthetics drove that ethical campaign. The flip side of that, of course, was The Voice. Fairness was the issue why The Voice went down, at the same time that fairness was the issue why the same-sex marriage campaign got up. Two progressive issues couldn't have ended more differently, because the wider issue of that doesn't seem fair was the central issue in the ethical argument.
Yes, so interesting. So in amongst all of this, and there's turmoil, and I think our young people are really feeling it particularly, how does the church now come in and offer a respite or a haven? What does the church, how do we speak into what's happening at the moment?
Well, I think the church already is offering that haven, I think. You are seeing a trickle of people returning to church. Whether that's a flood of, new converts, what you are seeing is a strong distinction that the church has something to offer that the world can't, even on either progressive or conservative post-Christian frameworks. So Augustine had to deal with this issue when Rome was collapsing, and he realised that there were two parallel cities, the two cities aspect. And so the church can offer a very clear understanding of what it means to flourish as a human. It can offer a very clear understanding that this world is not our home, that there's a theology of suffering in Christianity that is not seen in other parts of the world. There's a theology of forgiveness and a theology of how we use power. Now, that doesn't mean to say I think we should just give up any Christian public square space, but it is to say if we're very clear about the gospel and that we have an alternate narrative to people who are stressed and frustrated and anxious about where the world is going, we will start to see people say, how come they're not anxious in the midst of the turmoil? And I think Greg Sheridan's latest book, How Christians Can Succeed in the World Today, and another book by Nijay Gupta, Strange Religion, How the First Christians Were Weird, Dangerous and Compelling, they both pitch narratives of how the Christian community just looked different to what was going on in the pagan world at the time. I think that's still the answer.
So when you talk about it looking different, and we've talked in terms of the march, and let's talk in terms of both marches. We see, so if you're talking about the March for Australia and you see people holding up Nazi symbols, that actually taints the whole march. Then when we're talking about Christians, Steve, there are some glaring examples of bad behaviour from Christians. And so people point to that and they see this big picture, the same as you were talking about seeing a big picture in the march. People are looking at a big picture and they're pointing out really bad behaviour. And so that turns them off the entire, church. So how do we, I guess, I don't know.
You've got about 5. Have you got 5 hours of time, Wendy? Here's the thing on that, I think. Interestingly, the very time that people say the church is bad and it's not very bad, when Christians behave poorly, other people go, hey, you shouldn't behave like that. And you go, well, why not? Is it because Jesus didn't behave like that? And I think that's part of the issue, is that at the same time that the church is accused of bad behaviour, you want to ask, why is the world shocked by the church's bad behaviour? It's because the church should hold itself to a different standard. And the world indeed does hold the church to a different standard. They can't articulate why necessarily, but we want to show them that when we're more like Jesus, we line up more with what the standard we should look like. Now, that doesn't mean to say we will win friends and influence people necessarily, not everyone, but it does say that there'll be something weird, dangerous and compelling about us. And I wonder, many of the things that we're not liked for in the culture at the moment are things that I think that Christians should stand for, especially around what it means to be a human being. But other things I think we have to have a softer view on. We don't just want to be known as conservative people on issues, and I want a church where, and I'm culturally conservative, where the people who hold a progressive position on some political things and people who hold a conservative political position can be in the same church, because that can't seem to happen anywhere else. I want it to be able to happen in church.
I so want it to happen in church as well, because someone who is probably coming from that same conservative position, I need to be challenged by people who are thinking opposite to me to work out where I'm wrong, because I'm not right on everything. I can't possibly be, otherwise I'd already be in heaven. So I want to talk to people who actually disagree with me, but I want to be able to do that in a respectful manner. This is one of the reasons why I enjoy your commentary, because I do believe you do it in a respectful manner. So I'm going to tell people to look at your Facebook page, but you also have a website. It's stephenmcalpine.com. That's a PH, stephenmcalpine.com. Anyone listening to the program is if they're a regular, they've heard you and they know about your books. But you have a couple of books that I know of. You might have more. Just tell me if you have got more. But Being the Bad Guys, How to Live for Jesus in a World That Says You Shouldn't. Future Proof, How to Live for Jesus in a Culture That Keeps on Changing. These are books that I've made sure that my older grandchildren have, and I'm very grateful to you, Steve. Is there anything else that you would like people to know before I have to let you go?
I'm about to start writing the third one, which is provisionally titled Mind the Gap, which is going to deal with all of these issues, this polarisation thing and how we deal with it. So depending on whether I can put my head down, get a good cup of coffee, it'll be done sometime in the middle of next year.
Fabulous. We'll really look forward to it. And thank you so much for your time today, Steve. God bless you.
Thanks so much, Wendy. Great to speak to you.
Thank you.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.